mentioned, I'm Joey. I work at Igalia and I work on Node and V8. So I've been working on the startup performance strategic initiative in Node for a while. The initiative has recently been renamed to Startup Snapshot as we have done the integration within Node Core, and we are enabling this feature for user land applications, which is what I'm going to talk about today. So let's get started. A bit of history. The startup snapshot integration started while Node started gradually dropping the old small core philosophy and adding a lot more built-in features. This includes new globals, in particular new web APIs, new built-in modules, and new APIs in existing modules. And these new features either require additional setup during the startup of Node Core or require additional internal modules to be loaded during the startup. So to give you an overview from the last LTS version 18 to the upcoming 20, we've added support for Fetch, Web Crypto, File API, Blob, a bunch of web strings, and a bunch of new APIs under util, such as the argument parser and the MIME type parser. The list is longer than that, but you get the idea. Like, Node is growing a lot. And another part of this challenge is that the Node core is written about half in JavaScript and half in C++. So a lot of those internals in Node are actually implemented in JavaScript. This, the upside of this is that this lowers the contribution barrier. In some cases, it reduces the C++ to JavaScript callback costs. But at the same time, this makes it harder to keep the startup performant. For one, the JavaScript code needs to be parsed and compiled before they can be executed, and that takes time. And most of the JavaScript code for initialization only gets run once during the startup because it's just initialization. So it doesn't get optimized by the JavaScript engine. And when implementing a library in JavaScript, we have to take potential prototype pollution into account. You don't want the user to blow up the runtime just because they delete something from the building prototypes, like string the prototype that start with. So to mitigate this, Node need to create copies of these JavaScript built-ins as startup for the internals to use. They don't actually use the prototype methods that we expose to users. And all this can slow down the startup as Node grows. So to keep the cost of the startup initializations under control, Node Core uses multiple strategies. First, we do not initialize all the globals and built-ins as startup. For features that are still experimental or too new to be used widely or only serve a specific type of application, we only install accessors that will load them lazily when the user accesses them for the first time. And second, when building releases, we pre-compile all the internal modules to generate the code cache, which contains bytecode and metadata, and we empt them into the executable so that when we do have to load additional modules at user request, we pass the code cache to V8, and V8 can skip the parsing and compilation and just use the serialized code when it updates, when it validates that cache. And finally, for essential features that we almost always have to load, for example, the web URL API, the FS module, which are used also by other internals, or widely used timers, widely used features like timers, we captured them in a VS Startup snapshot, which helps simply skipping the execution of the initialization code and saving time during startup. So this is kind of how the Node executable used to be built and run. Initially, we were just embedding the JavaScript code into the executable at build time. And at runtime, we need to parse it, we need to compile it, we need to execute it to get the node core initialized, and before we can run user code and process system states to initialize the user app. And then we introduced embedded code cache. So at build time, we pre-compile all the internal JavaScript code and generate compile code cache. And then we embed into the executable. And at runtime, we'll ask VA to use the code cache and skips the parsing and compilation process. We'll still keep the internal JavaScript code as the source of truth in case the code cache doesn't validate in the current execution environment. But most of the time, the code cache is used, and we just skips the compilation process. And now, with the startup snapshot integration, we just run the internal JavaScript code at build time to initialize a node heap, and then we capture a snapshot and embed that into the executable. The other two are still kept as fallback, but at runtime, we just simply deserialize the snapshot to get the initialized heap. So there is no need to even parse, compile, or execute. The internal code is just like you deserialize the result. So what exactly are these VA startup snapshots? They're basically the VA heap serialized into a binary blob. There are two layers of snapshots. One that captures all the primitives and the native bindings, and one that captures the execution context, like the objects and the functions. So currently Node uses the isolate snapshot for all the isolates that you can create from the userland, including the main isolate and the worker isolates. We also have built-in context snapshots for the main context, the VM context, and the worker context. Although the worker context snapshot currently only contains very minimal stuff, and we're still working on including more stuff there. So with the default snapshot, the startup is generally like twice as fast compared to launching Node without snapshot. For example, on like this MacBook, it goes like from about 40 milliseconds to 20 milliseconds to start up Node core itself. And from these, so on the left, that's the Node core started up without the snapshot, and on the right, that's the Node core started with the snapshot. And you can see like even on the flame graph, there's less to be done, and it's obviously like much simpler and it runs faster. So yeah, and this also gives us more sustainability when we grow Node core while keeping the startup under control. And we are still tweaking the internal snapshot to make sure that the built-in one contains just the right amount of essential features, but also at the same time, the feature is now also available to users so that people can just create snapshots of their own applications. So this can be useful for applications where the startup performance matters. For example, like command line tools. In particular, if the application needs to run a lot of code during startup, or if it needs to load a lot of system-independent data, these operations can be done when building the snapshot instead of being done at runtime. So the general workflow is similar to the workflow for building the core snapshot. So Node can take a user-provided script somewhere to do some essential initialization for the user applications, and it can run that script to completion. And after all the asynchronous operations are finished, and like, for example, all the promises are resolved, Node can take a snapshot of the heap and write it somewhere in the either into one binary along with the node executable itself or as a separate blob on disk. And when starting up again, Node can just get the pre-built snapshot from somewhere and then deserialize a user heap from it to skip the setups. So currently, the userland snapshot only takes one file as input, so you'll have to bundle the setup code into one file. But we are also looking into userland module support in the snapshot building script. So yeah, that's also coming. And currently, there are two ways to generate the userland snapshot. So first is the tougher one, which is building node from source with the -- node snapshot main configure option, which tells the toolchain to generate a snapshot using the provided user script and replace the default snapshot with a custom snapshot. And the final node executable would contain the user snapshot. So for example, we have a file here that contains something like global this data, and I put some string there. Well, you can put many other complicated things, but this is like just an example. And then you go to the node source directory, and then you build it with that configure option, and then the final executable that gets produced by the compilation process will contain a binary that already has the snapshot that contains this thing that you put on the global this. And another option that does not require building node from source is using the -- build snapshot runtime option of the official node executable. So like that might kind of handy if you just don't want to build node from source, which can take a lot of time. So by default, this generates a blob called snapshot.blob to the current working directory using the given script. But you can also specify the output path with the -- snapshot blob option. And when you launch Node using a custom snapshot, you can again use that -- snapshot blob option as a way to tell Node to deserialize a heap from the specified custom snapshot instead of like setting up a default Node core heap. And that will like help you like skip the parsing, compilation, and execution of maybe your own code and help you run faster. And now there is another option that's work in progress, which is the new single executable application feature. And the snapshot can be layered on top of that. And this means that it will be possible to generate a snapshot and embed it into a single executable with Node itself without having to compile Node from source. So a quick preview of the current design is, so the user can create a JSON configuration like that one, snapshot. You specify the main script with snapshot main, the path, and then you specify where you want the output to be written. And then you use the official Node executable to take this JSON configuration and generate the blob. And then you copy the executable to your destination path because it's going to inject that blob. And you use, for example, the postject command line tool that is maintained officially by Node to like inject that blob into the binary, which is C there, single executable application. And then after you injecting the blob into that binary, that would contain a snapshot, and Node would just know that, oh, I have a snapshot embedded into this binary. When I launched, I will just deserialize that. And with this, you don't have to compile Node from source to use a embedded snapshot. So that's still a work in progress, but is coming. Probably will land in 20. And we're also thinking about instead of doing all this, we'll provide some kind of single line utility to you just get a JSON configuration, and then it generates a single executable application executable that you can just run without doing all this. And to help users create custom snapshots, so Node also offers several JavaScript APIs to help synchronize the runtime states in the snapshot script. So by default, after deserializing a snapshot blob, Node would refresh the runtime states like process.env and process.argv. And if the user code pre-compute something from these states or cache these states before the snapshot gets serialized, then this should be refreshed during deserialization. So, for example, if the user code computes some debug level here, based on the environment variable debug level like this in the snapshot script, so they might already been doing this when they are building the snapshot, then at runtime they can synchronize this with the snapshot synchronization API that we provide through the VA startup snapshot namespace. So for example, in the startup snapshot script, you can add a few callbacks that will be called. First will be a callback that can be called during the serialization process to reset that debug level. And then you add another serialized callback that can reset the debug level according to the environment variable configured at runtime. And that will help you synchronize these states back. Or you can just defer the computation until deserialization if you're building snapshot. That's also there is a getter called isBuilding snapshot that you can use from the API to determine whether the code is actually being run to build a snapshot. And another useful API is set deserialize main function, which allows us to specify a main function in the snapshot without having to pass another main script. So, for example, if the snapshot we have, there is a database of, for example, greetings in different languages. One way to log the greeting according to some environment variable during runtime is, for example, you can pass a separate main script that does the logging, but that means we'll need an additional input, which also needs to be parsed and compiled at runtime. So instead, you can use the JavaScript API, which can include a main function into the snapshot. So the code of this main function will be also compiled and serialized into the snapshot. So at runtime, Node can just deserialize this main function and just run it. Then we no longer need additional input, and it's also faster because there is now no need to compile more code. So a summary, we have been integrating startup snapshots into Node core to speed up the startup of the core. And now there is experimental support for userland snapshots with some JavaScript APIs in the VA startup snapshot namespace to help building them. And we are also working on support for single executable application as well as more features in the snapshot. Okay, so finally, I'd like to thank all the people who have been contributing to this feature, including Anna, Colin, James, Chen Zhong, Dashian, and many others that I'm forgetting about in the slide. Sorry. And also, personally, I like to thank Bloomberg and Igalia for supporting my part of work on this. And that's it. Thank you. Do I collect it out? Okay.
Thank you ever so much. You know the deal. Yeah, let's come have a chat. Hello. Thank you so much for that talk. Audience, both online and in the room, please do feel free to ask questions. Slido.com, 1404, or the QR code, which is same diff. Let me pull up the questions. I'm just going to open with, while I'm faffing around and getting questions and waiting for them. So far, what have you found the common misconceptions in the design, that people's common misconceptions are with the design of startup snapshots?
I think one common misconception would be that this is somehow related, the feature itself is somehow like people miss heap snapshot with startup snapshot a lot. They use like the same underlying infrastructure like in VA to like serialize a heap, but they're kind of different tools for different means. Heap snapshot is designed for like doing a diagnostic on the heap, and startup snapshot is meant to be rehydrated, whereas heap snapshot is not. Startup snapshot is. I think that's like there's so many snapshots in VA, so people can get confused a bit. Yeah, that's something that I commonly see.
Yeah, which also makes sense. They have similar names. People, as they're starting to learn them as well. We've got loads of questions. We went on my phone from having no questions to having absolutely loads of questions. So thank you to everyone in the room online who's been submitting them. Wow. All right. First question with the most upvotes. Can snapshots also be used to start up AWS Lambdas faster?
So this is not something that, because like in AWS, is not something you as a user can control, like how Node gets started up. So that kind of like the responsibility of using this kind of falls on whoever that runs Node. I think in this case, it kind of like falls on Amazon. So yeah, as a user of this, I was an embedder of Node. That's kind of like out of your control. But like if you're someone who can run Node yourself, or like if you can pass additional flags to Node, then yes, you can do that.
Awesome. Thank you. Next question is there any chance of accidentally leaking sensitive environment variables to the snapshot during the build time?
Which one?
That's all right. We can go through them together. It's the top one that is highlighted there. Is there any chance of accidentally leaking sensitive environment variables to the snapshot during build time?
So in Node core, we have like some internal assertions to make sure like you don't leak them. So we are also considering exposing this to the user land. But if you're deserializing a startup snapshot, usually you don't get to see them. It's very difficult that you get to see them because Node will refresh all of them. Mm-hmm. So yeah, so if you kind of like intentionally put something in there, that's possible. But also you can refresh them later.
Okay. All right. Yeah, although I imagine if people were doing it, it probably wouldn't be an intentional act. Definitely something I've been guilty of. How much of a startup boost has been tested to be achieved for user land startup snapshots?
So there is like literally a TypeScript compiler in Node core as a test feature to like test that we can snapshot the TypeScript compiler. So that's like you get still around. It's still in the range that I mentioned about. It's like 2 times faster. Like before, it's like 200 milliseconds, for example, on my test machine. And then when you turn the snapshot on, it's like 100 milliseconds. It kind of also depends on how much initialization you do in your application. If you do a lot, then you're going to save more because you're not even going to run code to initialize your application. You're just going to destroy the things. So yeah, but in general, I would say you can get like 2 times faster.
Cool. Thank you. We have time for one more, and we have a bunch that have 2 ticks to them. Let's actually go with the one that's right here at the top. What are the limitations of snapshots? For example, a TCP connection to a database won't be serialized, or perhaps there's other things to consider as well.
Yeah, that's what I mentioned earlier. Like because, for example, would be a async operation that needs to be finished before you take a snapshot. Because I'm pretty sure, like, it might be possible to somehow be able to deserialize a request, in-flight request, but also that's not currently a goal of this feature. So you kind of have to make sure there are no async requests before you take the snapshot, and you need to resolve the promises. And yeah, those are the current limitation of these startup snapshots.
Yeah, and hopefully start to build people's mental models around when it is appropriate to do this and when perhaps it may not make sense for a project. Let's actually do just one more here. How good of an idea is it to put all the code in a snapshot to optimize the startup of the whole app?
So one thing that you can do is like just wrap everything in a in a function that you don't actually invoke when you build a snapshot. And then when like you put that function as the deserialize main function in the snapshot. So when you deserialize, it runs the whole function. So like that's doable. But also you probably don't get enough compilation cache with that, because if they're not on the top level, VA will selectively compile some of those, but not all of them. There are some hints. So it's something that you can do. But also if you want optimal result, you can try to put more of them at the top level.
Yeah, makes sense. Awesome. Look, there are so many more questions. They fall down the bottom of the page, but we are out of time. So I will remind everyone, both in the room and online, that the speaker Q&A room is where to go to continue to ask questions about this topic. The physical space is out by reception to the left of the door as you're kind of facing to exit it. And those online, you can use the Q&A room in the spatial chat. But please join me in a massive round of applause for Joy. Thank you so much. What a fantastic talk.
Thank you.
Thank you.